Hi everyone, welcome back to Difference Frames the World. Today, we're going deep into one of the most misunderstood political figures in Asia, the Emperor of Japan, and how this ancient institution fits into today's tensions between China, Japan, and the United States. We're going to explore the emperors of old, the emperors who led Japan into modernity, their entanglement in war, and the emperors who emerged after the rubble of 1945. And yes, we'll also talk about how American leaders reshaped post-war Japan from top to bottom, from politics and security to the economy and media. In ancient Japan, the emperor was half king, half god. Let's start from the beginning, way back before shoguns, Japan's military leaders who actually controlled Japan, before samurai, retainers to lords, before Japan even had its current borders. In the early centuries, the emperor wasn't just a political leader, he was believed to be a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. This divine lineage fostered a sense of pride and reverence, making the emperor the sacred center of the Japanese world. But here's the twist: even though the emperor was technically the top, most political power eventually moved into the hands of powerful clans, regents, and later the military rulers, the shoguns. Whenever Japan sent delegations to ancient China during the Tang dynasty, those missions carried imperial authority, highlighting how the emperor's diplomatic role shaped regional perceptions and Japan's self-image. This insistence on parity shaped the psychology of Japanese diplomacy for more than 1,000 years. The Emperor of Japan is more of a symbol than a political leader, unlike the national leaders of other countries. If we have to find something to fit that role in China, it should be the dragon, which has linked the Chinese people together for thousands of years. The fact that military leaders, the shoguns, controlled Japan for hundreds of years, is the underlying factor making Japan the most belligerent nation, or at least one of the most aggressive ones, in human history. In the past 2 centuries, Japan has caused enough trouble for Asia-Pacific nations, including China, Russia, and the United States. Even today, it remains a troublemaker. Japan became an influential power in Asia after the Meiji Restoration, and for a short period, the emperor was brought back to power. In less than 100 years, Japanese invaders caused immense suffering in China and Southeast Asia, including Singapore, Australia, and the Philippines, highlighting their history of aggression. Fast forward to the mid-1800s. Western powers were knocking on Asia's doors with gunboats, cannons, and treaties that looked fair on paper but were basically legalized robbery. Japan had a choice: follow the Qing dynasty's fate of humiliation, or modernize fast. Japan chose to join the Western powers. The Meiji Restoration in 1868 restored the Emperor of Japan to the center of power. But this wasn't some peaceful return. It was a political revolution. A band of ambitious samurai toppled the shogunate, and used the young Emperor Meiji as a symbol to unite the country. Japan modernized in just a few decades. It built factories, railways, a Western-style army and navy, and adopted a constitution modeled partly on Germany's. The emperor's name was everywhere in schoolbooks, military flags, political slogans, like Chairman Mao on the Chinese mainland in the 1960s and 1970s. Japan didn't just want to catch up with the West. It wanted to join the club of empires. So it seized Taiwan after the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895, and held it until 1945. 10 years later, it defeated the Russians on Chinese soil in the northeast provinces and gradually controlled Manchuria in the coming decades till the Soviets drove them away in 1945. Notably, Russians and Japanese are traditional enemies. The Japanese should hate Russians more than they hate the Chinese. In East Asia, it also occupied Korea and turned it into a colony. Korean people, both in North Korea and South Korea, hate the Japanese. During the Second World War, it attacked Australia, and even today, Japan is the most hated nation for the Australian people. After Japan's unconditional surrender, Australia allegedly beheaded thousands of Japanese captives, although no official records support that. All of this expansion was done in the emperor's name. That connection was crucial because it linked the imperial institution directly to Japan's militarism for the next half-century, influencing its aggressive foreign policies. By the 1920s, there was a brief moment of democracy, political parties, elections, and freedoms. Japan seemed poised to become a mature constitutional monarchy like the UK. But then came the Great Depression. Economic collapse, social unrest, and ultranationalism allowed the military to take over. Generals and admirals argued that Japan needed resources overseas, and that military rule was the only way to save the nation. Like Germany, Japan is another grape on the vine of militarism. The emperor at this time was Hirohito. Now, people still debate how much control Hirohito had. Some say he was a prisoner of the military. Others argue he signed off on almost every major war decision. But one fact is undeniable. Everything Japan did, from invading Manchuria to the full-scale war in China, as well as the attack on Pearl Harbor, was carried out under the emperor's name and framed as loyalty to the throne. After the unconditional surrender was announced in 1945, many admirals, generals, and field commanders killed themselves at their posts, in bunkers or in private quarters. That meant the emperor became inseparable from Japan's wartime actions. He should be held accountable for the atrocities in China, brutal occupations in Southeast Asia, and suicidal fighting across the Pacific, emphasizing the need for acknowledgement and justice for past actions. And when the tide turned, Japan clung to the emperor as the final source of unity. August 1945 was the turning point. After two mushrooms, dropped by its closest ally today, killed hundreds of thousands in minutes, Japan surrendered unconditionally. Its cities were in ruins. Millions were displaced. The imperial system was on the brink of collapse. And then arrived General Douglas MacArthur, head of the U.S. occupation forces, who effectively became the most influential figure in Japan, shaping its laws, institutions, and national identity for years, earning him the title of the father of modern Japan. Ironically, Japan's American father was defeated by a Chinese general, Peng Dehuai, several years later, in the Korean War. MacArthur was then the king of Japan, and the emperor of Japan was as obedient as a domesticated cat. The Americans chose not to execute him or abolish the imperial system. Why? Because they wanted to use the emperor to stabilize Japan. But they also wanted to ensure he would never again be used to justify war. So they rewrote Japan's constitution, and the emperor went from a sovereign ruler to the symbol of the state. He no longer had political power. He became a ceremonial figure, like the Queen or King of England, but even more restricted. And then the Americans made even bigger changes. After initially trying to democratize Japan by weakening conservative elites and dissolving the giant conglomerates, the US suddenly changed direction. The Cold War was heating up. China went communist in 1949. The Korean War broke out in 1950. So Washington reversed course, the famous reverse course, and decided that Japan needed to be a strong anti-communist ally, not a social laboratory. That meant re-empowering conservative politicians, rehabilitating many wartime elites, strengthening big business groups, suppressing left-wing labor movements, keeping the emperor as a unifying symbol. The US essentially rebuilt Japan's political system to be stable, conservative, and aligned with American interests. Many criticized Japan for having become America's economic, political, and military colony. Still, Japan's rapid rise from the rubble of war was made possible by America's support. The US market became Japan's lifeline. American aid, military procurement, and access to US technology fueled Japan's economic miracle. And in return, Japan followed American economic and strategic priorities. American influence over Japan was deep, though not formal colonial rule, it was more like a long-term protectorate. In sharp contrast to its economic success, Japan had been militarily a dwarf before the US later changed its mind. Japan had initially been forced to give up the right to wage war. Article 9 of its new constitution renounced the use of military force forever. But then the US encouraged Japan to rearm, just enough to help America against the Soviets and the Chinese. That's how the self-defense forces were born. US bases remained, especially in Okinawa, despite protests of the local people, many of whom refused to admit they are part of Japan. And to this day, the US has tens of thousands of troops in Japan. Japan relies on American military protection. The alliance is the backbone of US strategy in Asia. So when people say Japan is a colony of the US, they don't mean literally. But the influence is undeniably deep, politically, militarily, culturally, and economically. Japan's post-war identity and institutions were shaped more by Washington than Tokyo. If we rename Tokyo to Tashington, few people will object. After the war, Japan's emperors took on a new mission: reconciliation. Emperor Hirohito remained on the throne until 1989, but avoided politics and sought to present himself as a peaceful monarch. Many in Asia never accepted this narrative because of wartime memories. However, he lived much longer than those comfort women in Korea and China. His successor, Emperor Akihito, made reconciliation a personal mission. He visited former battlegrounds, expressed remorse, and reached out to China and Korea. Many people across Asia respected his sincerity, even as they continued to criticize Japan's politicians. Today's emperor, Emperor Naruhito, continues that soft diplomacy, quietly acknowledging the past, attending memorials, speaking about peace. But here's the key point. The emperor no longer drives foreign policy. No one expects him to be so stupid as to say Taiwan's contingency is Japan's problem. He influences hearts, not strategies. Yet his symbolism still matters deeply in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia. When the emperor expresses regret or sympathy, people listen. When Japanese politicians visit Yasukuni Shrine, that symbolism becomes instantly toxic, even though Japan's emperors have not visited that shrine since 1978, after the shrine honored notorious war criminals there. Compared to the emperor's softness, Japanese officials have gone too far. Yasukuni Shrine has become their exclusive stage to show their political stupidity. Right now, Japan-China ties are at their most tense point in decades. The new Japanese PM said Taiwan's contingency is existential to Japan, hinting at a potential military intervention in case of a war across the strait. In addition, the Diaoyu Islands are a constant flashpoint. Ships, coast guards, and sometimes military aircraft shadow each other almost daily. Japan has become more vocal about Taiwan's security. Sanai Takaichi's tough stance catalyzes the worst tension between Beijing and Tokyo since 1972. In late April 2025, Takaichi led a Japanese delegation on a 3-day visit to Taiwan. She met with Taiwan's leader, Lai Ching-te, and other high-ranking officials from Taiwan's government and legislature. In statements at the time, she described Taiwan as a valued friend. She called for closer practical cooperation in areas such as economic security, technology, supply chain resilience, and informal security cooperation. Just days after taking office as Japan's first female prime minister, she made remarks about Taiwan that sparked the worst-ever diplomatic clash with the Chinese mainland. Her bold moves have posed existential threats to her country, hurting her people, for the benefit of the United States. The US wants Japan to be a frontline partner in deterring China. That means more joint drills, more missile deployments, stronger alliance commitments. China reads this as Japan once again aligning with an external power to counter Beijing. Especially when Ukraine and Russia are likely to reconcile, American Eagle's attention is turning to Asia. Prompting Japan to become Asia's Ukraine to provoke China has been a reasonable reckoning of why she acted so desperately. People have to ask whether Donald Trump, the real king of Japan, stands behind her. So here's the final big question. Can the Japanese emperor help improve China-Japan relations today? The answer is yes and no. The emperor holds moral authority, and his apologies and commemorations resonate throughout Asia, symbolizing continuity and peace. However, elected politicians make important policy decisions, and the US-Japan alliance greatly affects Japan's security strategy. The competition between China and the US is pulling Japan into regional conflicts. Military issues, not symbolic matters, drive tensions in Taiwan and the East China Sea. The emperor represents reconciliation but does not create policies. Today, Washington, as well as Tokyo's political leaders and regional geopolitics, shape Japan more than the throne does. Japan's emperors have witnessed significant historical events, including mythical beginnings, samurai rule, modernization, empire building, war, foreign occupation, economic growth, and now face a new era of great power rivalry. Once the emperor commanded armies, passively or aggressively, and ruined many neighboring countries in Asia. Today he commands history, memory, and the emotional fabric of the Japanese people. In a world where China rises, America repositions, and Japan faces new dilemmas, the emperor stands as a rare thing: continuity. But continuity can only soften, not solve, the geopolitical storms blowing across East Asia. As China-Japan tensions worsen today, the emperor can offer calm, tradition, and reconciliation, but Tokyo and Washington will decide the strategy, and Beijing will shape the reaction.